Welcome to our September podcast of Brainstorms, and we are here once again in beautiful Sycamore Studios in Plain City, Ohio. And I've got to say that this is one of the most important podcasts we're going to have this year to talk a little bit about history and honor and healing around the month of September for two major reasons. First of all, this is when we celebrate Patriots Day. And by celebrate, I mean we sit there to honor those who have served since 9/11. We're not talking just in the military. We're talking about people whose lives were ended that day in the World Trade Center. We are talking about the first responders and their families. And we're talking about every single middle school, grade school, or high school student that decided that day to change their whole history of their future by deciding to serve in the all-volunteer military. I have interviewed personally at least 90% of the young men and women from the global war on terror who I have spoken to, of the thousands I've spoken to, made their decision that day. And that is no small thing, particularly if you are a senior in high school, like Zachary McBride was, one of our major archangels on whom we founded this particular foundation. He had multiple scholarships, Rhodes Scholar, and decided that day that instead he would go to the military. He did a great job in the military and training, and 4 months into his service, he entered a booby-trapped house, and we lost him. We founded Resurrecting Lives Foundation because we could not bring Zachary or Brian Piercy back, but we are able to honor them by taking care of their brothers and sisters who return. So we know that from these wars, we have a lot of traumatic brain injury. We've been talking about it all year long. And with that comes post-traumatic stress disorder as well. And we are so blessed today to be speaking to a former Army Ranger. And if you guys don't know what Ranger is, we're going to be explaining that a little bit to you because I didn't understand it at first either. All I could remember were Green Berets. Well, these guys are, kind of Green Berets and a little bit of steroids on top of that. And we're very blessed to have Chad Jenkins with us today, who not only served in the military during the global war on terror, but also attended West Point, was their quarterback, and has developed a very unique and yet very telling way to recuperate, to bring back your brain and your soul from the moral injuries of war. The second reason this is so important is because September is National Suicide Prevention Month. And if you've been following the news, you know that we have now more than 5 times of our veterans have taken their own lives when they've come home than who have died in combat, than our military who died in combat. And that's on us. 7,100 died in combat, and that's a tragedy. Nearly 34,000 died with suicide, and that's on us, the civilian world. The 99% that should be opening our arms, our hearts, our communities, our jobs, our schools, our churches, to those who volunteered their lives for us. So without further introduction, I'd like to introduce a gentleman who has taught me more and so generously than anyone else, actually, in my quest for finding a cure for traumatic brain injury, Mr. Chad Jenkins. And Chad, welcome to our studios here. Luckily, we're both live in Dublin, so this is not too far for us to travel. But we'd really like to hear from you and welcoming our audience into what you've been through, your experiences, how you've gotten over them, and how you've literally dragged others with you. So good morning.
Well, good morning to you. It's wonderful to be here, Dr. Gordon. And I love being on this side of the microphone, having you question me, which is really, really fun. So, obviously, it's an important topic for our nation yes. to continue to talk about and to continue to pay tribute to the loss that we had on 9/11/2001, and then the lives affected throughout the globe, and right. specifically here in the United States, and with the first responders and firefighters and the military who either made that decision or were already in service when that day happened.
Right, exactly. And how did that change your life? Because I'm sure, you can tell the audience where you were,
right.
And
well, and I was a senior at West Point on that Tuesday morning, and we had just started our football season. We had just lost to the University of Cincinnati that Saturday previously. It was kind of a heart-wrenching loss. We lost in the last seconds of the game after going up on them, driving down to score a touchdown to take the lead, and then they came back and won. So we're a little bit deflated and dejected, but we're getting ready to play the University of Buffalo. And Monday we had off of practice. Monday was our off day, and then Tuesday was our first day to get back on the playing fields. And then obviously that morning, I was walking back. I had a first period class, and I passed my roommate, Dominic Tripotto, and he's like, hey, a little plane just flew into one of the World Trade Centers. Like, go turn the TV on in our room and take a look. They think it accidentally flew in there, because that was the first reports. And then when I got to my room and we could watch the TV, we had a coaxial cable that was hooked up to our computer to get like 3 stations. And one of the local channels showed then the second plane hitting the World Trade Center when I got there, like live. And then at that point, you know, the commentators and news analysts and everybody on started to piece together that this can't be an accident. And West Point quickly went on lockdown. We went on lockdown about 2 hours later, just due to the fact that you had then the Pentagon get struck as well. And then there was the 4th plane that got taken down in Pennsylvania, but they didn't know if West Point could potentially be a target. Right. And actually West Point, well, not West Point, but the Hudson River that West Point sits on was the navigational platform that the hijackers used from Boston to navigate themselves into New York City. So they flew right directly over West Point, making their way into the city that day.
Things could have been even worse for sure. Well, what was the feeling that you had and your roommate and those around you? Because I know that again, was one of those moments in history where you realize things are never going to be the same from this point forward.
And I think quickly we recognized that. I remember having almost like this anxious, adrenaline, heightened state of alert, if you will, even at West Point that day and that afternoon, and Dom and I talking about it and talking about like, hey, it's real. And I mean, 21-year-olds who had gone to a military school, who knew the potential, but everyone that signed up when we were freshmen or when we were at the prep school, it was a peacetime army. It was a peacetime military at that point. Really, Mogadishu in 1993 for the Ranger Regiment was really the last big conflict. And it was, relatively short considering what would transpire then on the global war on terrorism. Right. So there was a heightened state of anxiety, a little bit of adrenaline rush, and we were the only football team in the nation, Division I football team, to practice that day. Wow. And I look back on that. Todd Berry, our head coach, made the decision that we would practice. We would continue to get ready for the University of Buffalo. And I think that speaks kind of to our, Army officers in the military and what you have to do. While the nation was struck that day, the greatest strike on us, we still had a mission as Army football players to prepare for that day, to prepare for Saturday. And so we were going to get ready. And I think the greater thing is on a mission overseas, years later, understanding that there might be things going on the battlefield, but what is my task? What is my purpose? What is my mission? How am I going to get my men there? And I think that helped set the groundwork of understanding
Absolutely.
That years later.
Right. Absolutely. It's interesting that you bring that up, and this is just a little aside, but of all the young men that I've spoken to, many are football players. I mean, football is kind of that, get together as a large team and kind of outdo the enemy, that kind of thing. I will say that of everybody that has brought a young veteran back, if I can hook them up to their football coach, it is a win-win. It is the beginning. It isn't the whole way back, but it is the beginning. Because even when they are inundated with all these memories of the battles or who they lost, you can take them back to that one game, where they carried the ball and I was on. It was second down and 5 to go, and it really means something. So I think that your your coach knew that. And I think that speaks to, okay, this is something horrific going on, but we do have this mission and we're going to go for it. So that's a very interesting point, I think. And then later in the season, a lot of things happen because of 911 and your final game. If you wouldn't mind sharing that with the audience too, the Army-Navy game.
Yeah, Army-Navy, it was December 1st of 2001 in Philadelphia. And, we got word a couple days prior to the game that President Bush would be coming to the game. It would be, I think, the second big event. He threw out, I think the Yankees were in the World Series that year, and he threw out a baseball pitch or at one of the World Series. I can't remember the location, but this was going to be his second major kind of in front of a large open audience like that. So it was different. Friday when we got to Philadelphia and got to the stadium, having to walk through metal detectors, having to walk through Secret Service checking our bags even as we were filing into the stadium just to do our walkthroughs. Same thing Saturday morning. And then President Bush came into our locker room prior to the football game. And I could tell, and I've said it before, you could tell he was there, but he wasn't. I mean, his mind was focused because he had already launched Special Forces. He had already launched the 75th Ranger Regiment, which I would become a part of later on in my military career. They had already conducted an operation in Afghanistan, an airborne operation, jumping into combat there. So he had men and women, the military already deployed in that fight. So I think that's where, obviously and rightfully so, his mind and his focus was. But, I'll never forget, it was really General Schwarzkopf. He was in the locker room as well, and he probably gave us the most riveting speech. He said, "Men, not only do you represent Army football in West Point today, but you represent the entire United States Army, and the United States Army does not lose wars. So you will not lose today." And I mean, we got fired up at that. It was awesome. And we ended up going out and winning that game. And it was what's right about America, right? It was the most televised college football game for that decade.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and that's in 2001. So that decade of football, that was the most watched football game in college. And I think rightfully so is what we celebrate, that resiliency as a country. I think that's what the number one thing that comes to my mind thinking about that it's that proverb, no matter how many times you get knocked down, you get up one more time.
Yeah.
And that's what we did as a country that day.
I think so too. And there's something about, I still, get chills at sports events when the Star Spangled Banner is played, when, you see that flag flying, when you're surrounded by, tens of thousands of people who are feeling the same pride, in what we are, what we represent, what our goals are for, not only national peace, but global peace. So that is very amazing. So how soon after that did you all realize you're going to be heading into a very interesting part of the of history as well as the world?
Yeah, we knew, our teammates and even the Corps of Cadets, the classes that were a year ahead of us or 2 years ahead of us that had already graduated, that were already in, whether it was infantry officer basic course or they had just shown up to their unit assignments. We stayed in contact with them and realized, okay, they are getting ready to go. Like they're spinning up and they're getting ready to go. And I remember my senior year, the second to last game, I tore my PCL in my right knee. And I was upset. One, I wanted to play in the Army-Navy game, and thank God I was able to do that. But two, I wanted to make sure that after football was over, that I'd be okay to then join my class and get to my unit as quickly as possible to join whatever unit was, and if we were getting ready to go to whatever theater. And lo and behold, I had to have surgery. I had to have surgery in the spring, reconstruction surgery on my right knee, and it was a bit of a bummer to me because then I had to stay back as a graduate assistant football coach for 6 months the next football season to rehab that knee and get it ready before I could then join in the military service and infantry officer basic and everything else. Now, the way timing would have it, I kind of then married up and I was 6 months behind my classmates, but because of just the way it all happened, I ended up finishing airborne school, infantry officer basic, and ranger school in a manner in which I really didn't miss out on, linking up with my platoon.
Well, that's a really fast track for
Well,
people who don't understand.
I was fortunate for it to be as fast. It was about 8 months in Fort Benning, Georgia. And then I remember August of 2003, I finished Ranger School. I was going to take 30 days leave to kind of gain weight and kind of get back my health, if you will, and actually proposed to my girlfriend at the time, Emily, my wife now. And an old football officer at West Point who I knew really well, Chuck Schretzman, he reached out to me and he's like, Chad, I saw you put 30 days leave in, but I'm your new battalion executive officer in the 10th Mountain Division, and your platoon is getting ready to deploy in 2 weeks to Iraq. So he's like, I'll give you 7 days, go home, say goodbye to everybody, and then I need you back here so you have 1 week to prepare to take your men over. And so that's what I did.
That's a huge difference and a huge blow. And I think that that's a very important point for our listening audience, because I think that we civilians don't understand the sacrifice not only that you all make with your families, but the families make as well. I mean, Emily was looking forward to seeing you. Your parents were there was so much looking ahead, only to be, cut short. And by the way, you're going into a very dangerous situation where you may not return. I mean, that's a very profound statement right there. When we talk about, signing in for service and you can go anywhere at any time. And if you could just tell the audience a little bit about what some of that training, involves, because they don't know. I didn't know. And it's amazingly grueling.
It is. And I think it serves the purpose of the tip of the spear, if you will, which is in an austere environment in which, the mission of the Army is mission of the infantry, and really greater mission within the Army is to close with and destroy the enemy. And I think if you really step back, when I stepped back and looked at it years later, everything that I did when I joined West Point's prep school or West Point or Airborne School, and especially Ranger School, it was all to prepare us for that strict singular focus, to close with and destroy the enemy. West Point overloading us with academics, military, the sports, the amount that's put on our plate there to make us recognize what we can kind of clear from our schedule, focus on our mission at hand, really task organize strategically when we're not really thinking about that, but we're just doing it because it's survival, to get to the next class, to get to the next practice, to get to the next meal, and just that repetitive to keep going and to keep working at eliminating what doesn't matter and focusing on what does. Well, it all culminates when you're in combat, when you're dropped in combat and you have to lead men in combat and make those split-second decisions. And I think that's the singular focus. And then I think where hopefully organizations like Resurrecting Lives Foundation and others are getting better, and I think we as a military and as a country need to get better at then how do we unwind that after the fact? Because it serves its purpose. It's very valuable in the split second life and death situations and everything leading up to it. But unwinding that heightness of alert and that always on the go and always able to task organize and basically compartmentalize, well, that doesn't always serve well in life back here at home.
It doesn't serve well for anybody in life, for sure. When you're going on that midbrain fight or flight, you're always on attack or being attacked. It really takes away our frontal lobe, as we've talked about, the part that sits there and reasons and takes time and looks at things to do. And to your point, that you have some really good ideas about how one can do that. I know that you have members of your regiment who have, had great struggles with traumatic brain injury, with post-traumatic stress disorder. And so what are your thoughts on that from somebody who is there? Because the way I feel, the medical profession, our politicians, our government does not pay attention to what you all feel. One of the reasons I founded Resurrecting Lives is because I wanted to be a voice for those people who I thought had lost theirs. And the people who lost their voice were the people who volunteered their lives for the freedom of speech. It just seemed too ironic for me not to jump in. Yep. So give us some of your, you can talk about your service if you want, and you can talk about the journey back.
Yeah. And I also, with your intro and with today's topic being in the month of September and talking about 9/11, I was thinking about this too, and I'd be remiss if I didn't speak on it. Obviously, 9/11 holds such a large piece of my history, of the country's history, of all citizens. It's a timestamp that we'll always remember where we were, what we were doing. In the emotions invoked on that day. But when I took it a little bit further, sometimes I also think that we focus as maybe a veteran community or a military community so much on 9/11. And I think 9/11 from maybe a tragic standpoint, obviously those in the towers, those in New York City, those at the Pentagon, those on that plane that ended up in Pennsylvania, that's the most traumatic event of their lives that were personally and visibly touched that day, or the loved ones lost, that the families. But I will say war did not become real to me on 9/11/2001. War became real to me on November 2nd, 2003. And that was a day when a Chinook CH-47 helicopter got shot down in Fallujah, and my platoon of 38 men were the quick reactionary force, and we were on site within 15 minutes of that Chinook getting shot down. And we lost 16 American soldiers that day and 26 wounded, and we had to triage and get them out of there and secure that site for 5 days after as well. That's when war became real for me. And I say that because I think so many of us, in the veteran community, in the combat veteran community, while we might have not been directly touched by 9/11 on that day, we might have not lost a loved one, we might have not been in that situation, but, there's still a day like 9/11 for each of us. And mine's November 2nd, 2003. And others can be, maybe their first firefight, or the first time they lost, their battle buddy on their left or right. And I think we need to speak of those moments and recognize for those, because that's what I didn't do. I minimized.
That's what you all do, and particularly Rangers and Special Forces.
Because we're trained to, because of everything I talked about. We're to minimize emotion. We're to minimize, reason and sitting on things. We're to focus on what is the task that I'm taught to do right now. Right. So we minimize the emotion that might put a chink in our armor. And so my point in bringing that up is I hope others who maybe haven't done it yet can sit on and be like, okay, what is my 9/11? Like, when did war become real for me? Am I able to talk about it? Am I able to sit on it? What emotions does it invoke in me? And if it's something that I'm going to a bottle, or I'm going to a pill, or I'm going to something that I probably is not healthy for me, then maybe it's something I need to really sit on and focus on. And so I guess that's kind of, maybe a question that we can start to ask, like, hey, when did war become real, and what did that look like for those veterans out there who are not yet able to put a finger on why they're not living the life that maybe they thought they would at this point.
Exactly. And you talked about losing 16. Mm-hmm. That's 16 families.
Right.
Of multiple family members.
Right. Mm-hmm.
The first ones who see the casualty assistance, coming to their door, seeing, two uniformed people coming to the door. I mean, it just is amazing. And it's something we don't think about enough, I think. I really do. Yeah. So you come back.
Mm-hmm. So I come back from a year deployment. My first deployment was September of 2003 to September of 2004.
Which is a long time in a young person's life who is thinking of getting engaged and starting a family.
Right. It was 376 days. I never came home on a 2-week R&R, and I sent all my men home, made sure they all got back. But once I had gotten everybody back and time was ready to then deploy home, And actually, halfway through my deployment, on that year deployment, I ran into another Army football player who was years older than me, Pat Work, who is now, I believe, like commanding general of the 82nd Airborne.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's awesome, Pat Work. Look him up if you're listening to this. He's a man worth reading his story because it's impressive. But I ran into him on a target one night on a mission. My 10th Mountain Platoon was supporting his Ranger company. And he's like, Chad, you need to come to the 75th Ranger Regiment. He's like, I'll link up with you tomorrow morning. He's like, I'll have you fill out the packet and I'll take it. We're redeploying in a couple of days. I'll take it back and turn it in for you. So that's what I did. And I wanted to go and be with the best. I wanted to be, if I was going to be in the military for 5 years, I wanted to be with the absolute best unit. And the 75th Ranger Regiment, in my eyes and everybody's eyes, was the best unit. So I got home in September of 2004. Asked Emily to marry me that night, got a ring on her finger. She, thank God, said yes. And then in October, I went down to Fort Benning, Georgia, tried out for the 75th Ranger Regiment, made it through, and then was assigned to 2nd Ranger Battalion out in Fort Lewis, Washington. And so I did finally take those 30 days of leave. We had Christmas, and then the day after Christmas, Emily and I drove out to Fort Lewis, Washington, to sign in and and then I would do 3 more combat deployments to Iraq with 2nd Ranger Battalion as a platoon leader, company executive officer, and ground force commander.
And again, for our listening audience, I want to know that when you all say the best, you're talking about those in harm's way the most, so it really, I mean, Marines go forward, Special Forces go forward, Army goes there, everybody's in harm's way. But there are those that, kind of, what would you say, kind of seek out?
Well, you're actually absolutely right. And that's why I wanted to join that organization, because the 75th Ranger Regiment, as well as other Joint Special Operations units that is comprised of that greater Special Operations unit, we were doing the offensive operations. We were on the tip of being on the offense, and that's what I valued, I think, from my football days. I didn't want to be on the defense. The 10th Mountain Division, while I love my platoon, I love my company, but there were all too many often times when we were out on patrol just sitting ducks, and we were doing things that were stupid, quite frankly. Route IED clearance where we're dismounted and walking on the road looking for IEDs, I don't think is tactically very smart, and I voiced that, and it wasn't really heard to the greater extent. We did some things and the regular infantry units that I would not do, and I knew I wouldn't be doing in the 75th Ranger Regiment. We would be flying in on helicopters, landing on rooftops, and bringing death and destruction to our enemies, and on an offensive matter where we set the clock. We knew when we were striking, the enemy didn't. And I think that was what I loved about the 75th Ranger Regiment, is being on the offense and setting the conditions for when we would attack, not when we would be attacked.
Right. And also for putting an end as soon as possible, which I know has always been in, your mission. Mm-hmm. So you come back. Mm-hmm. And anybody say you're a little bit hyper? You're a little bit there. I mean, what was the welcome back Chad? Because the Chad that left is not the Chad that comes back.
Correct.
You can't be unaffected by that.
Right. And full transparency, I thought I was.
Okay.
Believe it or not, like I thought, like, no, it didn't affect me. Like, I knew what I was signing up for. I knew this. And maybe because of what I talked about the chink of the armor and not letting anything affect that and staying in that, heightened state of alert. And I remember, and I'll say it on this, and I've said it before, and it's not something I'm proud of, but I remember we would come back from our Ranger deployments, and they were very high operational tempo, doing multiple missions a night. We would be going for a shorter duration of time, but they were, yes, much more intense. And when we would come back from those, we would have to fill out a psychological evaluation, like worksheet. And everybody, it was kind of the standing joke, if you will, that we just wrote no and then a line all the way down
exactly.
it. Like, and the no's is like, did you see combat? Did you take the life of another? Did you, like, all the things that we were doing?
All the triggers that could be there.
100%.
No's.
And we just all blanket filled them out no's. And there was like, and I'm not proud of it. There was a little bit like if somebody did write on there and then got pulled aside, it's like, well, what are you doing? You're hurting us. You're hurting the unit. You're hurting because we wanted to get back, get ready, retrain up, and get even more proficient. And the only way you do that is staying together and staying in that tight-knit bond to get ready for the next one and the next one. And that was not effective because obviously now we have a bunch of guys who have seen a bunch of things, who are psychologically and physiologically being affected by him, and we're not being truthful and, you know, what it's doing to us or what it has done to us, what war has done.
I had an observation when I was doing volunteering at the VA to do the second level traumatic brain injury screenings. And everybody who I interviewed over the course of the year was like you. And I finally said, you know, I want to write a book that says, don't ask, don't tell. It's just not about sexual orientation. It's about everything. So, you know, definitely there are people somewhere in the military, in the DOD, in the government, who realize that those no straight down cannot be true. Right. That being said, you didn't tell, we're not asking, you know.
Right.
We asked. We asked, you answered, we're done, you know.
Right.
And I think that same thing happens when you come back. So what I know you've developed a particular, a really good strategy, one that I speak about in my book as well. In my book, I stated no one gets through a TBI without believing in a higher power.
Right.
No one.
Right.
You know, I do recall I'm a very, you know, kind of cheerful person or, you know, kind of hypomanic, I've been called. And yet there was that day, 6 weeks into it, where I still couldn't speak. I still couldn't see. I still couldn't move when I said, okay, you know, I'm going to leave. You know, I'm going to leave.
Right.
And then I couldn't figure out how to do it. And I'm there like, I'm a former ER doc. I've trained. I should know, you know, 50 ways, you know, right now. And I couldn't. And I remember taking so much time trying to figure it out. I said, okay, God, here's what we're going to do.
Right.
me making the bargain, right?
Right.
If you help me get better in 6 weeks, we'll revisit this then. And to this day, that conversation I had with God was what kept me here. Yeah, for better or for worse, for what people I think, but that's what kept me here. So tell me a little bit about what you've noticed among your men, what you've noticed among yourself, if that's true or not.
Oh, it is. I mean, I think my personal walk and mine is 100%, you know, with the Lord. I put him obviously first and foremost in the I don't even want to say recovery. I would just say in the journey back to where I am now, or the journey of where I am, not back, but just we're always moving forward. But the journey of where I am now, and I didn't always have him number one. And that's a daily struggle, making sure he's number one. And I fail more than I get it right. However, I think when there was my joint tactical JTAC, Joint Tactical Air Controller, Christopher Domey, he was killed in combat in 2011. And I was in the FBI at this time. I was a special agent in the FBI down in West Palm Beach, Florida, when I got the word on a Friday night that he had been killed. And it finally, that was the one that like brought me to my core, brought me to my knees. And I just couldn't figure it out. Now, it took years later. It wasn't really until 2017 that I walked into the VA and said, I need to talk to somebody. Like, I need help. And I think I did say I need help. And I know so many struggle with saying I need help. And I was just having a conversation with someone just this past weekend on that. And I wish it would be rephrased. And I guess I defaultly just said it myself. But I wish, especially in the veteran community, it would be more of a challenge. Like, are you willing to do the work?
Yes, I agree, because it's a boot camp of its own.
It is. I mean, I've listed everything that I've done kind of with the Ranger School and Airborne and Infantry Officer Basic and 4 combat deployments. And Chris Ann, I will tell you, starting the cognitive processing therapy, CPT, and sitting on, that November 2nd, 2003, or there was a spring of 2004 in which a bad incident happened during an ambush that I had to talk through as well. I think I know physically, emotionally, spiritually, and mentally, that was the hardest thing I'd ever had to do in my life, is sit on that and let those emotions that I had learned to block out ever since, adolescence all the way through West Point training, to block those out and don't let them get in, to finally let them resurface and be felt. That was the hardest challenge and the hardest work I've ever gone through. And it was homework every night, having to write out the traumatic events, read them out, figure out where I was stuck in those. But I would say anybody listening who hasn't done that, who thinks, oh, I'm too much of a man, or I'm too much of a alpha to go do that, I'm not needing help. Well, I would challenge that it's not help. It's actually doing work. And it might be the hardest work you've ever done in your life.
And being a rehab specialist, that's what we say about rehab. When on a previous podcast, I mentioned the reason we call this brainstorms is because I consider your brain being in a storm. And usually when I'm contacted by a young man or a young woman who is like at their end. I mean, They contact my unlisted cell phone number. I know that's a problem. And I've been contacted from 29 states. So we've got a national problem here.
Right.
And I tell them, okay, right now we're quiet. We're in the eye of the hurricane. You've already come through the first. I go, but now grab my hand, because I got to drag you through the other eye wall to get to the other side. And that's going to be as hard as what you went through. And you may not think so, but you're not only reliving that, but you're learning other things as well.
Right.
And where did you come down to your kind of your strategy, which I call it a strategy, but it's really a faith-based recovery. And I think we need to hear about that, because I will tell you it's the same thing that I did. I mean, I make no bones about the fact that I'm, Irish Catholic, that I was called into the VA office because I was going to be, let go from my volunteer job because I was diagnosing too many men and women from Iraq and Afghanistan with traumatic brain injury, and they were going to let me go. And I said, you realize I'm Irish Catholic, and today's St. Patrick's Day. And you're letting me go for doing the right thing? I go, what I worry about is this is not going to play well for you or me. Trust me, I've just been recruited. So tell me a little bit about your journey with that.
Well, I think I credit a lot to the West Palm Beach VA Medical Center. I was apprehensive of going to the VA, and I was apprehensive because I was going to church at that time. I believed in Christ. But I was apprehensive because I didn't think I would get maybe the spiritual resources and the spiritual healing that I was looking for. And lo and behold, when I went there and I was in the PTSD clinic, and they made you do a 4-part orientation when you showed up. And the first day of the orientation, they were talking about all the different talk therapies or treatments you could do. And then they said, hey, now we're going to talk about the groups that we have that you might want to be a part of. And sure enough, the Chaplain Beasley, got up at the end, and he's like, hey, we just founded a new group. It's the Healing Combat Trauma Group, and it's Christian-based, and it's myself and one of the psychologists who's a part of the PTSD team. And we were going through this, the Combat Healing Trauma Manual, issued by Crew Military, which is a nonprofit organization. And I was like, you got to be kidding. Like, yeah, that is like, all right, Lord, like my prayer that I asked out in the parking lot, like, Lord, just show me something, like, give me something that shows that like this is right. And then that was it. And I joined that group, and we went through this workbook, and I simultaneously was doing the individual talk therapy with my psychologist, the cognitive processing therapy. But then I would also go to that group every Wednesday from 1:30 to 4. And I tell you what, Chris Ann, like if I've ever seen a church at work, if I've ever seen when Jesus is talking about the hands and feet of the church, it was in that group with those 12 to 14 men and our female psychologist and Chaplain Beasley, like seeing, and it was predominantly Vietnam veterans. I was the youngest one in there.
Oh,
I was
wow.
only one
Okay.
of 2 OIF,
Oh,
OEF
really?
veterans.
Yeah. Not enough. Yeah.
Not enough,
Not
yes.
enough.
But the work of seeing the Lord show up in that, that 90-minute, time frame every Wednesday was, it was unbelievable. I was like, wow. And it really was powerful. And it really then set for me years later to start Christ Over Fear, because kind of emulating once an individual was willing to share their story and to share their story and what Christ had done in their life and where they were. And it was the most authentic. It was the most real. It wasn't the pretty, non-filtered,
Right.
everything. It was unfiltered, unedited, unapologetic, and it was awesome. And I was like, if I can get individuals to be willing to share their story on a podcast so that hopefully one day, whoever knows when it's going to be, somebody else who's maybe not far along in their walk or has questions can hear that episode and be like, wow, that resonates with me. So that was my whole goal of Christ Over Fear, is to really target the combat veteran community and target those who, wherever they are in their walk with Christ. I've had close buddies of mine who aren't there yet, but at least are willing to come on and be
Yes.
authentic and unedited about it. And I think that's what the Lord wants. That's what Christ wants. He wants the realness. He wants the rawness. If you look at any of the patriarchs that he's ever used, it's not the pretty, they have their lives together, and that's who he's using, those who are raw and real and authentic and who people gravitate towards.
Yes.
But he uses them.
Yes.
And they commit to him and they give their lives to him. So that's what the whole goal of that show is to get those interviews that are raw, transparent, and real. That's the tagline of the show.
Well, I will tell you, I have listened and watched several of them. And even though you can't say you ever get used to a suicide threat call. There's no such thing as getting used to it, because everyone is different. Every circumstance is different. But I sit there and listen to that, and it gives me, hope and strategy and faith going forward. And I really am interested in the fact of you telling our audience how to find your podcast.
Yeah.
Because I think that that's a major healing pathway. I do.
So it's easy to find. It's Christ Over Fear. You can find it on any podcast player. And then also we have a YouTube channel, Christ Over Fear, because we do show those interviews both in audio and video form. So if you like to watch it on, and it's the first Wednesday of the month. We did take a break over the summer, just with kids out of school and everything else. And it's me, myself, and I that kind of find the guests and everything else. So I said, all right, I'm going to enjoy my kids this summer and be home, but we're getting ready to start back up here now that fall has presumed and kids are back in school. So it's the first Wednesday of every month. From noon to 1 p.m. Eastern time. And you can watch it live on the YouTube channel or on LinkedIn. And then also on, your Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever player you want to listen to, Christ Over Fear.
And I think it actually, you have combat veterans here, but it's for anybody who's struggling. We realize we have a suicide epidemic right now in our nation. And I think there's something to be learned from everybody there. And I want to let our audience know that the only reason we are doing brainstorms is because of your idea about the podcast, and how moved I was by watching you and watching those stories, and how those stories, to your point, two of them in particular have helped me on about 4 of those calls that I get, I refer folks, please take a look at this, because I can only speak from my own, like I tell my vets, I go, sure, I have that scrambled brain. and, regardless of the fact I was not in combat, I do have PTSD from that incident. But I wasn't heroic. I wasn't courageous. I was clumsy. And if it can do that much to me, for one, hitting your head against a brick wall, literally, God's irony, okay, Chrisanne, you think you got this? Let me tell you what it's like, and when I came back, literally so much of my brain was gone that it was no human being understood what I was going through because I had been, a caregiver my whole life. And suddenly I'm not able to give it. I need it. And there's no one, so I always say that, it was me and God on the floor of my family room for 6 weeks saying, okay, out there in the desert, well, what are we going to do now?
Well, and it sounds like that's probably the journey to have you solely rely upon Him, right?
Yeah.
And when you look at it now,
absolutely.
like what was the purpose behind this, so that you fully went to Him for the reliance?
Right. And it's interesting now because when you do that, and I mentioned that with people, no, you're my number 2 guy, but my number 1 guy is telling me something different. They look at you, whoa, what's going on here?
Well, and to get back to the show and Christ Over Fear, I think you're right. And it's what we talked about even earlier. When I was talking about, hey, for veterans or for those who had served or active military, like when did war become real?
That's a very good question.
And I guess I don't know off the top of my head how to phrase it for outside of, of military, but I guess when did life get hard? Maybe that would be one. Like, when did life get hard? To your point, like Christ Over Fear, it's targeting the combat veteran community, but it's not exclusively
Correct.
for the combat veteran community. And I think that's, we minimize, you said everybody that you talk to typically minimizes, but civilians minimize the traumatic events of their lives as well. I've experienced, well, Chad, I can't talk to you because, you're talking about something that's validated because it's combat. Like mine's just this, like, no, there's not just like it's real. And so understanding that we are affected and that it does play a pivotal role in our lives. And if we don't address it and we just think we can wash it away and put it to the side and not address it, well, then that leads to a recipe of pain and not living our life to the fullest.
Any hopes in the future of getting those kind of group therapies in every VA? So tell us just a little bit about that, please.
So Chaplain Beasley was really a proponent of that. I have nothing to say ill will towards the VA. They've been great to me in my personal health care, the mental health services, all facets. But they're so in West Palm Beach, they did start to get it in a couple of their outer, I can't CPACs or whatever they're called, like the community centers.
The C-Box.
C-Box, the community centers. And I couldn't answer honestly on where that stands as far as, there was a point in time where I was emailing a guy in Washington, D.C. trying to get it at every VA facility in the country. I don't know where that stands. It would be very valuable for individuals who are looking for that, but I don't know where it stands today.
Okay, well, that's a kind of leading into my say goodbye to the audience with a challenge here, with a takeaway. Come March 2025, we will have a new administration. And, my slogan is, quit running for office, start running the country. Let's get going. So with March being, not only is March named after Mars, the god of war. It's when Julius Caesar would amass his troops and start, going back out to conquer more lands.
Right.
Not only does it have that, but it also is National TBI Awareness Month. So what we would love to do is to get some strategies like this to bring to Washington, D.C. Here's the exact program. Emulate it in 10 VAs.
Right.
And let's get a pilot program going with that. We also know things like being awarded the Military Order of Purple Heart when you deserve it, when you've had a brain injury, when you've been injured in that capacity, even though it's a quote-unquote invisible injury, it's an injury of combat. Being awarded that is another suicide prevention strategy. So we're going to kind of brainstorm before that. We would love to have you come down and give that kind of conversation. I'm pretty sure we will be able to get in Senator Dan Sullivan from Alaska. We just delivered Veterans Standing Together Across America flag to his state with that purpose. The state that has the largest military and suicide percentage among veterans in the nation. We do have some ears that are listening. So, you have a great voice. I am so thankful that you came and joined us today and that you've been willing to be my mentor. You're one of the youngest members of the Ohio Veterans Hall of Fame. We're so proud of you for that. And, to our audience, I'll kind of turn to now and say, please keep looking at these podcasts. Please look at our website at resurrectinglives.org, because come the first of the year, we will be having actual campaigns. Write your congressman, write your senator. These are things that we absolutely need. We're not going to go way off track here. We're going to start with some of the basic. Give them the honor of their service. Give them a higher power to help to relate to. Because one of the things that I find out is, I don't have to tell God my story. He knows it, he knows it. And I'm just kind of relating my perspective on it. And it's always great for me to get his. So thank you all for joining us. Chad Jenkins, look him up. Look up him in his football uniform. Look up, West Point football. And for sure, look up that, 2001 game, of Army versus Navy. Every time that you feel that maybe our patriotism isn't quite where it should be, look that up and realize, the military is the most diverse population we have, and yet they volunteer their lives for each other. So we are the United States of America. We are staying that way. And in 2025, we're going to get stronger. Thank you so much for joining. Bye-bye.
If you are thinking about harming yourself or attempting suicide, tell someone who can help right away. Call 911 for emergency services. Go to the nearest hospital emergency room. Call or text 988 to connect with the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. This podcast is made possible thanks to a grant from the Overwatch Alliance, and it's produced by the Resurrecting Lives Foundation at the Sycamore Studio. Music is written, performed, and graciously provided by Tim Beckley. Remember, when you work toward brain injury recovery, it is best to journey with a friend and keep your gait steady and your spirit strong. Finally, always seek shelter from your storms.